I've been a Christian for 47 years. It goes back to 1974, and whenever I think about it, there's all kinds of new layers and new ways of looking at it, and this would probably be the most current way I've been thinking about it. I want to start with Gospel of John, chapter 10, verses 7 to 10. So Jesus again said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." In July 1972, 49 years ago, I was traveling with a friend and was arrested while camping on a beach in Mazatlan, Mexico. We had some things in the car that would be considered legal today. Mazatlan is on the west coast of Mexico, about 1,200 miles south of the U.S. border. The policeman in charge sat us down at a picnic table near the beach, pulled out his gun, put it on the table in front of us, and said, "You're going to jail for 3 to 5 years." It's funny what one thinks about when they're faced with a shock like that, but the only thing I could think of in my mind was, I'm going to learn how to speak Spanish. Anyway, so a moment later, he also said, "That's a nice tent you have there." And after exchange of possessions and money for freedom, the police officer and his companions escorted us to the edge of the city and said, "Adios." There are more details to the story, but I wanted to highlight it briefly because at that point, I was 22 years old. I was on a downward slide to nowhere, and this was a glaring neon sign in my life saying that very thing. After those days, I ended up with just the clothes on my back and nothing else at my parents' home in Northern Ontario. They were very gracious and good to me at that time, and I stayed with them for nearly a year. In those days, I descended further down the slope to nowhere. In my abundant spare time, I read books that I thought would shed light on my existence and help me out of this hole I dug for myself. I remember reading a book about Buddha called Siddhartha by a German author, Hermann Hesse, and another by a Lebanese mystic, Khalil Gibran. There were others, but they all sounded like they were for special people with special insights into existence. They didn't come to me in any meaningful way. My parents had a big unread Catholic Bible on a bookshelf in the living room. It had full-color pictures of popes and cardinals to impress me, I guess. I borrowed it and sat by my bed, and it sat by my bed for quite a while. I had been thinking that, like other books I was reading, that the Bible was some sort of wisdom literature. Actually, that is more true than I understood at the time. I didn't read much of it because I knew very little about it. But one night I popped it open randomly and I landed in Matthew chapter 13 and I read these words. The parable of the sower. A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on the ground, where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on the good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. This parable terrified me at the time because I thought it was a metaphor or an allegory about life. And I thought that Jesus was just another sage like these other guys that I was reading, and he was saying that there were 4 categories of people in the world. At this point, all the friends I had grown up with were gone. I was alone in this town that I lived in. They were all getting educations, or they're out in the world getting on with life. I honestly thought that Jesus, just another enlightened one, was saying that everyone fell into one of the 4 categories. And this is where I saw myself. I saw myself as the second part. Other seed fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, and because they had no depth of soil, when the sun rose, they were scorched. And I saw myself as having spent all my years before I was 22, I was traveling the world and I was getting involved in all kinds of things, mostly bad. And I had come to the end. That was the end of my life right there. Excuse me. Anyway, the parable terrified me. At this point, all the friends I'd grown up with were gone. I said that before. They were all getting educations out in the world and getting on with life. I honestly thought that Jesus, another enlightened one, was saying that everyone fell into one of the 4 categories. Sometime in those days, I did express a prayer like, God, if you're there, help me. So anyway, about 6 months later, there's lots more to the story that I'm leaving out, but there's things that it would just go on and on. About 6 months later, in August of 1973, I found myself in Kitchener looking for a place to stay. I had, as a last-ditch effort, trying something in life, applied to Conestoga College, and they had sent out a brochure. I'd gotten in. They sent out a brochure with accommodation suggestions. The only one on the list that I called was an inn near the college. The guy, his name was Jim, who owned it, came into town to the Walper Hotel in Kitchener, downtown, and picked me up. On the way back, he told me that a friend of his was coming to the inn, and that while he had been away for a year, he had become a Jesus freak. Now, I don't know if you all know what that means, so Jesus freak. For us who were older, everybody was called a freak who had long hair in those days, and they just attached the word Jesus to it. So I was fully expecting a hippie-like character with long hair and beads and frilly jackets and sandals and everything. But that's not what happened at all. I met this guy, his name was Bruce, and we're still friends after all these years. He talked about Jesus, not in some mystical, out there kind of way, but as if he were alive and present. In fact, in the next few months, while I lived in this inn, I began to get the strongest, distinct impression that Jesus was, in fact, alive and present. And there were others who had come to that inn, and there's a whole group of us who were still friends after all these years who became Christians. Some months later, I did confess that I knew Jesus was resurrected from the dead and that he was who he said he was. I think one of the most distinct impressions I have from those days is that whenever my friend Bruce was in the room and he was talking to somebody else, he was witnessing or telling somebody about the Bible or about Christ, I felt like he was talking directly to me, and even though he wasn't. And he actually never said anything directly to me. It was always the secondhand stuff that I picked up. And I got the distinct impression that he was, Bruce could be talking about the weather, and all I could hear was Jesus talking about the weather. It was just the strangest thing. But out of that, I got, as I said, this strong impression that Jesus was alive. So, I knew that Jesus was resurrected from the dead and that he said that he was who he said he was. So that's a snapshot of what happened to me 47 years ago. Now, there's a lot of other things I could say about what's happened since then. The rest of the story goes something like this. There have been many steps forward, and sometimes just as many steps backward. This book, the Bible, describes it all and puts it all into context. It is wisdom from God, and in it are the words I read at the beginning of the Gospel, from the Gospel of John. I have come that you might have life, and life more abundantly. Jesus proved to be the door for me into a new abundant life. Thank you.